It was Tuesday, late October, just after 2 p.m., when I realized something I had never imagined could happen to me. The wind off the Bow River had that sharp, metallic bite only Calgary can offer in the fall, and my fingers, stiff from the cold, trembled slightly as I fumbled for my keys. But the keys were useless. My own building's front door refused to acknowledge me. Click after click, nothing. The lock was cold, unyielding, final. And in that precise moment, standing there with the city's gray sky pressing down, I felt a kind of disbelief I had thought reserved for strangers, for news reports, for the sort of thing you only read about in other people's lives. Here's the paradox I never expected to live. A parent, a retired professional who had spent over 4 decades interpreting the law with meticulous care, could be rendered powerless by their own child. I had spent my life believing that knowledge, experience, and reason were shields, that they could protect me from injustice. Yet here I was, excluded, ignored, humiliated, by someone I had raised, someone I had trusted. But here's what I didn't know then. This door, this lock, was only the beginning. I could feel the faint smell of wet concrete mixed with the tang of autumn leaves that had blown in from the street. It clung to my coat, to my hair, to my thoughts. My heart thumped in a way that felt both familiar and alien. Not panic, not fear, just the quiet realization that a betrayal had occurred, and I had no idea of its full depth. And yet, I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I simply stood there, letting the cold seep into my bones, letting the silence do what words never could. I glanced around. A few tenants walked past, glancing at me with mild curiosity, their faces a blur behind fogged glasses. Nobody intervened, nobody called out, and perhaps that was worse than anything else, the isolation. My own son had made sure of it. I thought of the dinners we had shared, the weekend fishing trips on the Bow, the promises whispered over birthdays and graduations. And in that quiet, metallic moment, I understood the cruelest truth. Sometimes the people you love most are the ones who can hurt you the deepest. Yet even as a shiver ran through my spine, there was a strange clarity. I remembered the courtroom, the long hours spent studying precedent, the patience required to untangle fact from deception. I had tools at my disposal that this moment, however humiliating, could never take from me. But that knowledge, buried beneath the shock, felt dormant, waiting for the right moment. And so I stood there, fingers brushing the cold metal of the door, the city's hum a distant murmur, asking myself a single question I could not yet answer. How had it come to this? Because if I had learned anything in 68 years, it was this. Injustice rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it waits quietly, masquerading as a lock, a silence, a moment of absence, until you are forced to confront it. I took a slow breath, letting it fog the glass in front of me, and for the first time that afternoon, a thought solidified in my mind, one that would guide every action I took in the days to come. One simple, immutable truth: you cannot measure the depth of betrayal by the force of the act alone. You measure it by the calm with which it can be faced, and by the precision with which justice can be delivered. I didn't know who would pay for this or how, but I did know that the answer would come, and when it did, there would be no doubt, no escape, and no mercy wasted. I am 68 years old, and I have lived most of my life in Calgary, Alberta. My days were once measured by the rhythm of the courtroom, the crisp shuffle of papers, the low murmur of legal assistants, and the precise cadence of argument. For 43 years, I practiced law at Palmer & Associates, Vancouver, commuting often for high-stakes corporate cases, yet I always returned home to this city, to the Bow River's steady curve and the quiet streets lined with maple and elm. Now retired, my professional life has narrowed into daily routines that feel deliberate, almost sacred after decades of judgment and negotiation. My mornings begin with the same ritual. At 6:15 a.m., I brew a cup of dark roast from a local Calgary roaster, the smell of coffee, rich and bitter, filling my apartment, and I sit by the window, watching the early sun glint off the bow. It's a calm, measured moment, one I've earned, though it is tinged with the memory of Eleanor, my late wife. She passed 5 years ago from complications after a minor surgery. Her absence has left the apartment quieter than I anticipated, each room carrying traces of her presence, the faded scarlet throw over the sofa, the delicate scent of lavender lingering on her favorite armchair. Even now, when I reach for her mug out of habit, I feel the echo of her hands around it, warm and precise. Yet my life is not without companionship. Raj Mehta, a retired colleague and longtime friend, checks in every Wednesday and Saturday. He drops by for chess, a slow game of strategy that reminds me of the courtroom battles I once waged, where patience and foresight mattered more than force. On Wednesdays, Raj brings along his grandson, Liam, a young, curious 8-year-old with a perpetual question about everything he sees. Liam's questions pierce through the silence that sometimes threatens to swallow me, offering a sense of continuity and innocence that temper the sharp edges of the world.
I've always been meticulous. My apartment is organized with a legal mind's precision, files and documents arranged by year, subject, and relevance, every pen in its designated holder, books lined according to topic and author. And it is here, among these orderly rows, that a small secret resides, a hidden skill I have yet to reveal. Years of discreet investment in the legal sector have left me with financial instruments and accounts that even Raj does not fully understand. Carefully structured trusts, precise stock allocations, and accounts under my name but scattered across provinces. They have always been for protection, a silent assurance that nothing can undo the life I have built. But for now they are dormant, waiting. I am methodical in thought and measured in expression. Anger is a luxury I have rarely afforded myself. Precision is my tool, and silence is often sharper than any raised voice. In my apartment, I maintain a calm routine, mornings by the window, afternoons for reading and correspondence, evenings for chess and reflection. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant clang of the city's streetcars, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, all are constants, grounding me in a life that is predictable, safe, and, until recently, secure. And yet, even amidst this order, there exists a subtle tension I had begun to notice over the past months. Small things, a hesitant glance from my son, a delayed reply to a routine text, the faint pause before he answered the phone. I chalked it up to ordinary adult distraction, but the smallest irregularity has a way of becoming the clearest sign of what is to come. I am aware, with the same precision I once brought to cross-examination, that life can shift on a whisper, and I have learned to pay attention to whispers. One morning, while sipping my coffee, Liam tugged at my sleeve. "Grandpa, why do you always make sure your pens are straight?" he asked, eyes wide, innocent. I smiled, tracing a line with my finger along the desk. "Because, Liam, sometimes the smallest details protect you more than the loudest words." That day, I didn't know that the lesson applied to more than just stationery. That lesson would soon extend to my life, my home, and the betrayal that was quietly taking shape. I've lived 68 years with a steady hand, measured judgment, and a precise sense of timing. And though I do not yet realize it, those qualities will be the very tools I will rely on when the quiet betrayal reveals itself. Before the door incident, I had spent years quietly supporting my family, believing that generosity was a responsibility, not a choice. The first major sacrifice was on Tuesday, March 14th, 2017, when I gave my son, David, $47,300 to cover the down payment on his first condo in Rosedale. He hugged me, eyes shining with gratitude, and promised he would never forget this. I believed him, as I had believed so many promises before. The second sacrifice came 2 years later, on Saturday, September 9th, 2019. My daughter, Claire, needed $32,800 to help with her tuition at the University of Calgary. I wrote the check without hesitation, telling myself it was an investment in their future, though a small voice whispered that she could have found other solutions. I ignored it. The third and most significant was on Thursday, July 23, 2020. David needed $58,200 to cover medical expenses for his partner, who had undergone an unexpected surgery. I delivered the funds in person, feeling the weight of the cash in my leather briefcase and the warm summer air mixing with the faint scent of my cologne. "I've got you, Dad," he said, a glimmer of sincerity in his voice. I nodded, pressing the check into his hand, unaware that this trust would be exploited. It was during this last visit that I noticed the first subtle behavioral detail. David's handshake was slightly limp, his gaze flicking toward my briefcase more than my face. A humanizing trait appeared simultaneously. He paused to help a neighbor lift groceries up the stairs, showing that he was not entirely self-serving. Still, something unsettled me, a shadow beneath the surface of familiarity. I returned to my apartment that evening, listening to the soft hum of the heating vent and the distant honk of traffic, and felt a quiet doubt I could not name. But as always, I dismissed it, telling myself that loyalty, trust, and patience were the pillars of family life, and in that dismissal lay a calm before the storm. It was Sunday, November 21st, 2021, at 3:42 p.m., during the building's annual residence meeting in downtown Calgary. The room smelled faintly of coffee and varnished wood, a familiar comfort that did nothing to soften the sting of what was about to happen. I had arrived early, briefcase in hand, preparing to discuss the renovation budget, unaware that my own son, David, had other plans. As I approached the front, I noticed the empty chair beside the management table, the one reserved for me. At first, I thought it was oversight, but as the meeting progressed, the secretary, Paula Chen, called my name twice. No response. I realized then that David had locked me out. My hands tightened around the edge of the wooden podium. The ice in my glass of water clinked softly as I gripped it, throat dry. When he finally appeared, he smiled, a casual, almost amused expression. "Dad, maybe it's time you let someone else handle things," he said, his tone precise and cutting in its calmness. There was no malice in the inflection, only indifference. I did not raise my voice. I did not gesture wildly. I simply felt the settled tremor of betrayal settle into my chest. Around us, the other residents murmured, rancing between us. My presence was both acknowledged and ignored simultaneously. In that moment, the proof was undeniable. The keys in my pocket, the phone calls unanswered, the locked lobby, all tangible evidence of exclusion. I left the building quietly, the crunch of frost under my shoes the only sound marking my departure. I walked along 8th Avenue, the late autumn wind biting through my overcoat, and I thought of Eleanor. How would she have reacted? With dignity, yes, and measured precision. That is what I resolved to do. I didn't know yet what I was about to find. After the incident at the residence meeting, I began to notice irregularities in my accounts. The first was minor but suspicious, a $4,250 withdrawal from my investment account at TD Canada Trust on October 5, 2021, labeled David R. Personal Expenses. I assumed it was a clerical error,
something explainable. But the pattern soon emerged. Next, I found 3 transfers totaling $12,430 from my Rosedale trust, all occurring between June and September 2021, labeled Emergency Fund with vague notes. Dates aligned suspiciously with David's requests for cash. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate. I documented each transaction, using the meticulous spreadsheets I had maintained for decades in my legal practice. Every number, every date, every note became evidence. The third layer revealed itself through my old colleague Raj Mehta. On Saturday, December 4th, 2021, I walked him through the statements at my apartment, the smell of fresh coffee from my machine mixing with the faint autumn air drifting through the window. Raj, squinting at the screen, said, "This is deliberate. He's exploiting your trust systematically. Look at these totals." The cumulative betrayal was staggering, $152,780 in withdrawals and transfers over 14 months, all routed through accounts I had assumed were secure. Every transaction indicated intent, every date matched David's known financial needs, and every note suggested deception rather than urgency. I alternated between pages of spreadsheets, my eyes scanning numbers with the precision of a courtroom cross-examination, and moments of stark realization. The person I had trusted most was orchestrating a calculated exploitation. Each entry, each sum, each timestamp told a story of betrayal that was impossible to ignore. By the time I had compiled the final spreadsheet, I held in my hands the full picture, total amounts, complete timeline, and unmistakable intent. I did not gloat, I did not speak, I simply leaned back in my chair, the faint hum of the heating vent in my apartment the only sound, knowing that the reversal was imminent. It was Thursday, December 16th, 2021, at 10:07 a.m. when I finally addressed David. I called him into my office at Palmer & Associates, the space I had retained post-retirement for private consultations. The scent of polished oak and leather-bound law books filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of Earl Grey tea I had poured for both of us. "David," I began, voice calm and precise, "I have reviewed every transaction between June 2020 and October 2021, every withdrawal, every transfer, every note. The total comes to $152,780. I placed the neatly organized spreadsheets on the desk. His eyes flicked from the paper to mine, searching for some reaction. There was none. I remained still, hands folded, letting the silence underscore the facts. He leaned back, denial threading his tone. "Dad, this isn't what it looks like. You know I only use the funds for emergencies." I nodded, letting him finish. "Emergency for whom?" I asked, still calm. "Your partner, yourself, or convenience? The records speak plainly." David's expression shifted to bargaining. "Please, Dad, I was going to pay it back. I just needed time." "I measured your actions," I said, voice unshaken, just as I would in court. "Intent is clear, planning is evident, trust was violated deliberately." My killer line landed without flourish. I protect what is mine, even when it is blood. Then I outlined the consequences. Locks to my Calgary apartment changed immediately, accounts frozen at TD Canada Trust and RBC, formal filings submitted with the provincial courts to document financial exploitation, and a lawyer retained for potential restitution. Every action precise, every measure deliberate. David said nothing further. The quiet in the room spoke volumes. Facts, law, and evidence, not anger, had delivered justice. I poured tea for myself, the steam curling in the cold morning light, and allowed him the space to absorb what had just occurred. The reversal came quietly, precisely 1 week later, on Thursday, December 23, 2021, at 2:16 p.m., inside the Calgary courthouse. I had retained my courtroom presence long after retirement, and now it became the instrument of resolution. David underestimated the reach of my experience, assuming the emotional weight of the betrayal would overshadow legal precision. I presented the evidence to Judge Lorraine McAllister, a stern but fair arbiter I had known professionally for years. The spreadsheet, each transaction neatly annotated, detailed the total $152,780 that had been misappropriated, every note, every date, every dollar aligned with his previous requests, a timeline that left no room for ambiguity. David's eyes widened as the judge reviewed the documents. He turned to me, attempting that fleeting charm he sometimes used on family, a nervous smile, a half apology. But there was no room for words. Silence carried the weight. The courtroom itself seemed to exhale. Raj Mehta, seated in the gallery, nodded at me subtly. Beside him, Liam tugged at Raj's sleeve. "Grandpa's right. You can't trick someone who knows the rules." The moral, simple and pure, struck with perfect clarity. The court ordered restitution, accounts frozen, and formal documentation that preserved my authority and property rights. David's access to the building was revoked until compliance was complete. My hidden strength, decades of legal expertise, meticulous documentation, and patience had neutralized the betrayal. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply collected my coat, the leather smooth under my fingertips, and walked out of the courtroom. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the marble hall. Outside, the wind carried the sharp tang of late December, biting yet invigorating. I felt the calm satisfaction of justice achieved, not through vengeance, but through precision and restraint. And in that moment, Liam's voice, quiet and honest, lingered in my memory. The rules matter, and so do the people who follow them.
By the start of January 2022, life had returned to a rhythm both deliberate and serene. I had regained full control over my Calgary apartment, the locks now robust and secure, and all accounts reconciled under my oversight. The restitution ordered by the court ensured that the total $152,780 David had misappropriated was recovered in full. He had lost access to the building, the funds, and, most importantly, the quiet trust that had once defined our relationship. The legal resolution was concrete, but the peace it brought was deeper, more personal. My days returned to familiar patterns, infused now with an unspoken clarity. Mornings began with coffee and quiet reflection by the Bow River, the scent of brewing beans mingling with the crisp winter air. Afternoons were reserved for chess with Raj Mehta or brief walks through the nearby streets, the crunch of snow beneath my boots reminding me that each step is deliberate, purposeful. Evenings were quiet, spent reading or listening to classical music, a soft counterpoint to the precision and logic that had dominated the past weeks. A new relationship, subtle yet meaningful, had emerged. Eleanor's niece, Margaret Sinclair, recently widowed and living alone in Rosedale, began visiting on weekends. She asked nothing in return, no favors, no validation, only company, conversation, and the occasional game of Scrabble. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a replacement for the toxic bond I had severed, a relationship built on mutual respect and quiet warmth rather than obligation or betrayal.
Even David, now distant and cautious, was partially reintegrated through supervised communication. He had acknowledged, in court and in private, the full scope of his misdeeds, and while reconciliation was fragile, it existed in the form of measured, mediated interactions. I did not pretend to forget, nor did I offer blind forgiveness, but I accepted the possibility that some bridges, cautiously rebuilt, could withstand scrutiny and time. I noticed the smallest things that once seemed mundane, the hum of the heating vent, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, the way sunlight glanced off the Bow River at 8:14 a.m. Each was a reminder that life continues, that order and calm can be restored even after the most personal betrayal. The chess games with Raj Mehta became richer, longer, and filled with quiet jokes that reminded me laughter, like trust, can be rebuilt selectively. Most importantly, I had learned to measure generosity with precision, to safeguard it with clarity. My hidden assets, my legal knowledge, and the patience honed over decades had become shields I now carried openly in my daily life. Peace was not the absence of vigilance, but the assurance that when boundaries were crossed, they could be enforced with dignity and effectiveness. I walked along 8th Avenue one crisp afternoon, feeling the city breathe around me, and understood that equilibrium is earned, not given. Every action taken, every boundary enforced, every quiet morning and evening now carried the weight of deliberate intention. The past betrayal lingered like a shadow, but it no longer dictated the shape of my days. I had reclaimed my life, and in doing so, discovered a quiet strength that ensured it would remain mine. If you are watching or reading this, I want you to pause for a moment and consider your own life. Think about the relationships you have relied on, the trust you have extended, and the moments when that trust may have been quietly tested. I am speaking to you not as a distant narrator, but as someone who has lived 68 years with careful attention to both law and human nature. I have learned, sometimes painfully, that betrayal does not always announce itself with fury or shouting. Often it arrives in the form of a silence, a locked door, or a misplaced promise. Small, almost imperceptible details that reveal character more than words ever could. In my legal career, I spent decades analyzing facts, interpreting contracts, and understanding human motivation. The same principles applied when David betrayed my trust. Patience, observation, and precise documentation became my instruments of justice. And that is the lesson I hope you carry with you. Your life experience, your skills, your intelligence, no matter how dormant they may seem, are tools you can deploy to protect yourself. You are not powerless, even when the hurt comes from someone you love. Consider your own boundaries. I granted generosity, support, and faith to my family over years, sometimes ignoring the quiet voice of doubt. And yet, I discovered that careful attention to details, a financial record here, a legal precedent there, can shield you when trust is violated. You have the right to enforce boundaries without guilt. You have permission to protect your home, your finances, and your emotional well-being. That is not vengeance. It is dignity. I think often about Eleanor, my late wife, and the small lessons she left behind. The importance of precision, of calm in the face of challenge, of unwavering clarity in one's principles. These are not abstract ideas, they are practical tools for life. Like my chess games with Raj Mehta, or the meticulous order of my apartment, they teach a simple truth. Measure, patience, and careful action protect more than anger ever could. To those of you facing betrayal, exclusion, or subtle manipulation, trust your instincts, observe the details, and act with precision. Do not allow the weight of another's actions to redefine your life. Remember that generosity is a gift, not an obligation, and that skill and knowledge, whether professional, emotional, or practical, are yours to wield. Protect yourself, quietly and deliberately. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries. The ones who don't, they were never yours to begin with.